"She's just a useless old woman," my daughter-in-law said, her voice clear enough to cut through the soft clinking of wine glasses and polite laughter, and for a moment, everything in that dining room seemed to pause around those words like they had been waiting to land. I remember the way the chandelier light reflected off the crystal glasses, how the table was set perfectly with the good china I had used for years, how the turkey sat untouched at the center as if even it knew something had shifted. No one corrected her. No one even looked surprised. A few people exchanged glances, the kind that pretend discomfort but carry curiosity underneath. My son, Daniel, sat to her left, his hand wrapped loosely around his glass, his eyes fixed somewhere just past me, as if I had already disappeared from the room. I didn't rush to defend myself. I didn't raise my voice. I simply folded my napkin, smoothing the fabric slowly against my lap, and looked at her with a calm I didn't feel. "Are you done?" I asked, my voice steady, almost gentle, and that seemed to unsettle her more than any argument could have. She blinked, just once, then laughed lightly as if it had all been a joke, as if calling someone who had spent decades building that very home useless was just part of the evening entertainment. The others followed her lead. A few chuckles. A few forced smiles. The kind of laughter people use when they're not sure which side they're supposed to be on. I sat there for a second longer, letting the silence stretch just enough to be noticed, then I placed my napkin beside my plate and stood up without a word. My chair made a soft sound against the hardwood floor, louder than it should have been, and still, no one stopped me. Not Daniel. Not anyone. The hallway felt colder than the dining room, even though the thermostat hadn't changed. I could still hear their voices behind me, already returning to safer topics, as if nothing had happened, as if I had always been meant to leave that table early. I walked past the living room where family photos lined the walls, each frame holding a version of us that no longer existed. There was one from 20 years ago, Daniel in his college jacket, smiling wide, his arm around me like I was the center of his world. I didn't stop to look at it. I already knew what it showed. By the time I reached my bedroom, the house felt different. Not quieter. Just clearer. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands resting in my lap, the same way they had been at the table, and for the first time that evening, I allowed myself to take a slow breath. It wasn't the insult that stayed with me. Not really. It was the way no one challenged it. The way it fit too easily into the room, like it had been said before, just not out loud. I glanced at the dresser, at the small stack of papers I had brought home the day before, still neatly aligned where I had left them. 24 hours earlier, I had been sitting in a quiet office across from a bank manager who kept adjusting her glasses as she scrolled through accounts I didn't know existed. Accounts in my name. Assets tied to trusts I had never been told about. Documents signed years ago, when I thought I was just filling out routine paperwork at my husband's request. Edward had always handled those things. He used to say, "You don't need to worry about the details, Margaret. I've taken care of everything." At the time, I believed he meant for us. I didn't realize he meant for me. I reached out and placed my hand on the top sheet, not picking it up, just feeling its presence there, steady and real in a way that nothing at that dinner table had been. Down the hall, I could hear Jessica's voice again, lighter now, confident, filling the space like she owned it. Maybe she thought she had won something tonight. Maybe she thought saying those words out loud made them true. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my dress the way I always did, the same small habit I had carried through years of hosting, of caring, of making sure everything ran smoothly for everyone else. Old habits don't disappear overnight. But something else had changed. Not in the room behind me. Not in her voice. In me. I turned off the bedside lamp, letting the room fall into a soft shadow, and walked back toward the hallway, my steps quiet. Measured. I didn't need to return to the table. I didn't need to correct anyone or explain myself. They had already said everything they believed. And I had already learned everything I needed to know. By the time I reached the end of the hallway, their laughter had settled into something comfortable again, something familiar, as if the evening had corrected itself without me. I paused just out of sight, listening for a moment longer, not to what they were saying, but to how easily they moved on. Then I turned away, my hand brushing lightly against the wall as I walked toward the front door. I didn't slam it. I didn't make a scene. I simply stepped outside into the cool night air, closing it gently behind me. And as I stood there on the porch, looking out at the quiet street I had lived on for over 30 years, I realized something with a clarity that surprised even me. She thought she had just humiliated me in front of everyone. What she didn't understand was that she had just given me exactly what I needed. I did not go back inside. I stood there on the porch longer than I needed to, not because I was waiting for anyone to follow me, but because I wanted to feel the distance settle between who I had been in that dining room and who I was about to become. The night air was cool, carrying the faint scent of damp leaves and something distant, like a neighbor's fireplace just starting up. It had always been a comforting smell to me. That night, it felt different. Sharper. Clearer. Like everything else. I walked down the 3 wooden steps slowly, my hand brushing against the railing that Daniel had helped his father install nearly 20 years ago. He was barely in his 20s back then, eager, proud, asking his father if he had done it right. Edward had smiled and said, "It is not about doing it right the first time. It is about paying attention." That was the kind of man he was. Careful. Observant. Always thinking 3 steps ahead. I used to think that meant he worried too much. Now, I was starting to understand that he simply saw things I had chosen not to. I got into my car and closed the door gently, the sound muted, contained. 4. A moment, I just sat there with my hands resting on the steering wheel, looking at the house through the windshield. The lights in the dining room were still on. Shadows moved behind the curtains, shifting and blending, as if the people inside were part of the house itself now. I realized, with a strange sense of calm, that I no longer felt like I belonged in that picture. Not in the way I once had. I started the engine, the soft hum filling the quiet space around me, and pulled out of the driveway without hesitation. I did not know exactly where I was going at first, only that I did not want to spend the night under that roof. After a few minutes, I found myself driving the familiar route toward the small extended stay hotel just off the main road, the one I had passed 100 times but never once considered entering. The parking lot was half full, lit by a row of overhead lights that buzzed faintly. It was not a place anyone would describe as special, but it was clean, quiet, and most importantly, it was neutral. No memories. No expectations. Just a room with a bed, a desk, and a door that locked. I checked in with a young man at the front desk who barely looked up from his computer as he handed me the key card. "Room 212, he said, his voice routine, uninterested. I appreciated that. I did not need sympathy. I did not need questions. I took the elevator up, the soft ding marking each floor, and stepped into the hallway that smelled faintly of laundry detergent and something artificial, like a scent meant to reassure people that everything was under control. Inside the room, I placed my purse on the small table and sat down on the edge of the bed, just as I had done at home earlier. The repetition did not escape me. Same posture. Different place. I took off my shoes and lined them neatly beside the bed, another habit I had carried with me for years. Small acts of order in a world that often felt unpredictable. Then I reached into my purse and pulled out the folder. The papers inside were exactly where I had left them. Crisp. Untouched. Waiting. I opened it slowly, not because I was afraid of what I would see, but because I wanted to absorb it fully this time, without distraction. The numbers were still there, steady and undeniable. Account balances that did not belong to someone described as useless. Documents that listed my name in places I had never expected to see it. Trust agreements, investment portfolios, ownership structures. Words I had heard before but never truly engaged with. I read each line carefully, tracing the letters with my eyes as if they might shift if I looked away too quickly. They did not. Everything remained exactly as it was. Clear. Intentional. Planned. Edward had not left anything to chance. That realization settled into me more deeply now, away from the noise of the house, away from Jessica's voice and the echo of that word she had used so casually. Useless. I let the word sit in my mind for a moment, not to relive it, but to examine it. To see if it still held any weight now that I knew what I knew. It did not. Not in the way it had at the table. It felt smaller now. Almost irrelevant. My phone buzzed softly on the table, the screen lighting up with Daniel's name. I looked at it for a few seconds without reaching for it. He was calling out of habit, I realized. Not out of urgency. Not out of understanding. Just because the situation had shifted in a way he did not recognize, and he needed to restore whatever version of normal he was comfortable with. The phone stopped ringing, then buzzed again almost immediately. I turned it face down and let it be. There would be time for conversations later. Tonight was not about explaining anything. It was about understanding everything. I leaned back slightly, the bed dipping under my weight, and stared up at the ceiling. It was plain, white, unremarkable. No history attached to it. No expectations pressed into its surface. Just a clean space above me, empty and open. For the first time in a long while, my thoughts were not racing to keep up with everyone else's needs, everyone else's demands. They moved at their own pace, steady and deliberate, connecting pieces that had been scattered for years. Jessica's tone at dinner. The way Daniel avoided certain topics. The subtle shifts in how decisions were made in the house. The small exclusions that had seemed insignificant. At the time. Each memory aligned itself with the documents in front of me, forming a pattern that was impossible to ignore now. I had not been pushed aside by accident. I had been gradually repositioned, step by step, until I occupied a place that was easy to dismiss. Predictable. Manageable. And now, suddenly, I was neither. I sat up again and closed the folder, placing it carefully back into my purse. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that does not press in on you but instead gives you space to think. I reached over and turned off the lamp, letting the darkness settle in around me, soft and even. Outside, a car passed by, its headlights briefly tracing across the curtains before disappearing. I lay back against the pillows, my hands resting lightly on my stomach, and closed my eyes. Not to sleep. Not yet. Just to sit with the clarity of it all. By the time morning came, they would still be in that house, still moving through the same routines, still believing they understood the structure of their lives. They would not know that something fundamental had already shifted. Not with an argument. Not with a scene. But with a decision made quietly, in a room no one knew I was in, holding information no one had thought to share with me. And as I lay there in the stillness, one thought settled into place with a certainty that surprised even me. I did not need to prove anything to them. I only needed to act at the right moment. The next morning arrived quietly, without drama, without announcement, as if the world had decided not to interfere with what I was about to do. I woke before the alarm, the faint light slipping through the curtains in thin lines across the ceiling, and for a moment I simply lay there, listening to the stillness. It was not the kind of silence that feels empty. It was the kind that feels deliberate, like a pause before something important begins. I sat up slowly, placing my feet on the carpeted floor, grounding myself in the present moment. No voices in the hallway. No footsteps overhead. No one expecting anything from me. I dressed carefully, choosing a simple navy dress that I had worn many times before, the kind that did not draw attention but always made me feel composed. I brushed my hair, pinned it back neatly, and looked at myself in the mirror for a moment longer than usual. There was something different in my expression. Not anger. Not sadness. Just clarity. I picked up my purse, making sure the folder was still inside, and left the room without hesitation. The drive back into town was calm, the roads just beginning to fill with early morning traffic. People heading to work, stopping at coffee shops, moving through routines that had likely not changed in years. I wondered briefly how many of them believed their lives were stable simply because nothing had challenged them yet. I pulled into the bank parking lot at exactly 9:15, 10 minutes after it opened. The building looked the same as it had the day before. Glass doors, polished floors, the quiet hum of transactions happening behind counters and screens. Inside, the same woman from the previous day looked up as I approached, her expression shifting from polite recognition to something more attentive. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, standing slightly from her chair. "I was hoping you might come back." I nodded once, placing my purse gently on the desk. "I have a few questions," I said, my voice steady. She gestured for me to sit, already turning to her computer, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. "Of course. I have your file open from yesterday. There are several accounts and structures here that we should go through carefully." I folded my hands in my lap, watching the screen reflect faintly in her glasses as she scrolled. "Start with the trust," I said. She paused briefly, then nodded. "The Whitmore Family Trust was established 12 years ago," she began, her tone measured. "Primary beneficiary, Margaret Whitmore. That is you. Secondary conditional beneficiaries are listed, but their access is dependent on specific terms." I did not interrupt. I let her continue. "You are also listed as the sole controlling authority on all major financial decisions tied to the trust. That includes property, investment accounts, and business holdings connected to Whitmore Construction Group." I felt the words settle into place, each one confirming what I had begun to understand the day before. "And my son?" I asked, not because I did not already suspect the answer, but because I wanted to hear it clearly. She glanced at the screen again. "Daniel Whitmore is listed as a potential successor under certain conditions, but he does not currently have control or direct access." I nodded slowly. That matched the pattern I had been piecing together. "What conditions?" I asked. She hesitated for just a second, then turned the screen slightly toward me, pointing to a section of text. "There are behavioral and compliance clauses," she said carefully. "They are not uncommon in larger trusts, but these are more specific than usual." I leaned forward slightly, reading the lines myself this time. The language was formal, precise, but the meaning was unmistakable. Respect. Conduct. Protection of the primary beneficiary. Any act that could be interpreted as harm, neglect, or public humiliation could trigger a reassessment of access rights. I sat back again, the weight of that information settling into something solid and undeniable. Edward had not just prepared for the future. He had anticipated the possibility of exactly what had happened the night before. "Can these conditions be enforced immediately?" I asked. My voice did not change, but I noticed the way she straightened slightly in her chair. "Yes," she said. "If you, as the primary beneficiary, determine that those conditions have been violated, you have the authority to initiate a review. That can include restricting access to associated accounts and assets until the matter is resolved." I let a brief silence follow her words. Not to create tension, but to give myself space to consider the next step without emotion clouding it. "What would that process look like?" I asked. She began outlining the procedure, her tone becoming more formal, more structured, as if she understood that this was no longer a general inquiry. "We would document your statement, initiate a temporary hold on relevant accounts, and notify any affected parties through official channels. Legal counsel would then review the situation to determine the extent of any permanent changes." I listened carefully, noting each step, each implication. This was not about reacting. This was about acting correctly. "And the timeline?" I asked. "The initial hold can be placed immediately," she said. "Notifications would typically go out within 24 hours. I nodded once more, my decision settling into place with a calm certainty. I reached into my purse and placed the folder on the desk, sliding it toward her. "Then we should begin," I said. She looked at me for a moment, as if assessing whether I fully understood what I was asking. Then she nodded, her expression shifting into something more focused. "All right," she said. "I will need you to confirm a few details." As she prepared the necessary forms, I sat there with my hands resting lightly on the desk, watching the process unfold. There was no rush in my movements. No urgency in my tone. Everything was deliberate, measured. When she handed me the first document, I read it carefully before signing my name at the bottom. Margaret Whitmore. The same name that had been dismissed the night before. The same name now initiating a process that would change everything they thought they controlled. When I finished, I handed the pen back to her and closed the folder, placing it once again inside my purse. "Is there anything else you would like to review?" she asked. I shook my head slightly. "No," I said. "I think I understand everything I need to." As I stood up to leave, she added quietly, "Mrs. Whitmore, if you need any additional assistance, please do not hesitate to contact me." I gave a small nod, acknowledging her professionalism, then turned and walked toward the exit. The glass doors opened smoothly as I approached, letting in the bright morning light. Outside, the day had fully begun. Cars moved steadily along the road. People walked with purpose, unaware of the quiet shift that had just taken place inside that building. I stepped out onto the sidewalk and paused for just a moment, taking in the air, the light, the sense of forward motion that seemed to surround everything. Somewhere, not far from here, Daniel and Jessica were likely just starting their day, still believing they understood their place in the world, still confident in the structure they thought supported them. They would not know yet. Not until the notifications arrived. Not until the access they relied on simply stopped responding. I adjusted the strap of my purse on my shoulder and began walking toward my car, my steps steady, unhurried. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel angry. I felt something far more useful than either of those things. I felt prepared. By the time I got back to my car, my phone had already lit up with 3 missed calls and 2 messages from Daniel, the kind of messages that try to sound calm but carry something restless underneath, something that does not yet understand the problem but knows one exists. I did not open them right away. I placed my purse on the passenger seat, started the engine, and sat there for a moment, watching people move in and out of the bank as if nothing significant had happened. A woman laughed as she walked past with a paper cup of coffee, a man checked his watch, someone held the door open for a stranger. Ordinary moments continued, uninterrupted. It reminded me that most turning points in life do not come with noise. They arrive quietly, and the only people who recognize them are the ones standing inside them. I pulled out of the parking space slowly and drove back toward the house, not because I felt drawn to it, but because there were things there that still belonged to me, things I had not yet decided what to do with. The neighborhood looked exactly the same as it always had, the same trimmed hedges, the same mailboxes lined along the street, the same sidewalks that had carried decades of routine. When I turned into the driveway, I noticed Daniel's car was already there. Jessica's was not. That detail did not surprise me. She preferred late mornings when she could arrange her day on her own terms. I parked, turned off the engine, and sat for just a second longer before stepping out. The front door was unlocked. It always had been. I pushed it open and stepped inside, the familiar scent of the house settling around me like a memory that had not yet realized it was fading. Daniel was in the kitchen, standing near the counter with his phone in his hand. He looked up the moment he heard the door, his expression shifting quickly from relief to something more complicated. "Mom," he said, taking a step forward. "Where did you go last night?" His tone was careful, measured, as if he was trying to choose the right version of concern. I set my purse down on the table and removed my gloves slowly, placing them beside it. "I needed some time," I said. I did not offer more. He waited, as if expecting an explanation to follow. When it did not, he continued. "You left without saying anything. Jessica thought maybe you were upset." I glanced at him briefly. Then turned my attention to the window above the sink, where the morning light filtered in the same way it always had. "Did she?" I said quietly. It was not a question that required an answer. He shifted slightly, his grip tightening around his phone. "She did not mean it the way it sounded," he said. "It was just the way the conversation was going. Things got out of hand." I let a small pause settle between us, not to create discomfort, but to allow his words to exist fully in the space. "Out of hand," I repeated, my voice even. Is that what you think happened? He did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked down at the counter, then back at me, as if searching for the version of this conversation that would return everything to its previous shape. I think everyone was just stressed, he said finally. There has been a lot going on. I nodded once, acknowledging the effort without agreeing to the explanation. There is always something going on, I said. That does not make certain words appear by accident. He exhaled quietly, running a hand through his hair in a gesture I had seen countless times when he was younger, when he was trying to solve a problem he did not yet understand. So what do you want to do about it? He asked. The question hung in the air for a moment, simple on the surface, but carrying more weight than he realized. I turned to face him fully now, meeting his eyes with a calm that did not shift. That depends, I said. On what you believe needs to be done. He hesitated, clearly not expecting the question to return to him. I think we should just move forward, he said. Let it go. There is no reason to turn this into something bigger than it is. I studied his face for a moment, not with judgment, but with a kind of clarity that had been missing before. It is already bigger than you think, I said quietly. He frowned slightly, confusion replacing the practiced calm he had been holding on to. What does that mean? He asked. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I walked past him into the living room, my eyes moving over the furniture, the photographs, the small details that had once felt permanent. He followed a few steps behind. Waiting. It means, I said finally, stopping near the fireplace, that some things do not become serious when we react to them. They become serious the moment they happen. He crossed his arms, not defensively, but as if trying to steady himself. You are making this sound like something it is not, he said. It was one comment. I turned slightly, looking at him again. It was not one comment, I said. It was the first one said out loud. That seemed to land differently. He did not respond right away. Instead, he looked away, his jaw tightening just slightly, as if something in him recognized the truth of that but did not know how to address it. Jessica has been under a lot of pressure, he said after a moment. We both have. I nodded again, slowly. And I have been here, I said. Watching. Listening. Adjusting. I let the words settle, then added, do you know what that looks like from my side? He shook his head slightly, almost unconsciously. It looks like I have been making space for both of you for a very long time, I continued. And last night, I realized that space had become something else entirely. He shifted his weight, his expression tightening further. So what are you saying? He asked. That you want to leave. That you do not want to be part of this family anymore. I held his gaze, steady and clear. I am saying that being part of something requires recognition, I said. And I am no longer interested in pretending that I am invisible. The room fell quiet after that, the kind of quiet that does not invite interruption. He opened his mouth slightly, then closed it again, as if the words he had been preparing no longer fit the situation. Finally, he spoke, his voice lower now. What are you going to do? He asked. I allowed a small breath to pass before answering, not because I was uncertain, but because I understood the importance of timing. I am going to take care of what needs to be taken care of, I said. It was not a threat. It was not a declaration. It was simply a statement of fact. He looked at me, trying to interpret what I meant, trying to find the familiar version of me that would explain everything in a way that made him comfortable. He did not find it. Mom, he said, softer now, you are scaring me a little. I did not smile. I did not soften the moment. You should not be scared, I said calmly. You should be paying attention. Daniel did not respond immediately after I said that. He stood there, his shoulders slightly tense, his eyes searching my face as if he was trying to find the version of me he understood, the one who would soften the edges of what I had just said and turn it into something manageable. I did not offer him that. I walked past him slowly, toward the staircase, my hand gliding lightly along the banister as I made my way upstairs. Each step felt deliberate, not heavy, not rushed, just steady. The house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet than the night before. This one carried awareness. I entered my bedroom and closed the door gently behind me. The room looked exactly as I had left it, everything in its place, the bed neatly made, the curtains half drawn. It could have been any other morning. I crossed the room and opened the closet, reaching for a medium-sized suitcase I had not used in years. I placed it on the bed and unzipped it slowly, the sound soft but clear in the stillness. I did not pack quickly. I chose each item with care, folding it neatly, placing it inside without hesitation. A few dresses, a sweater, comfortable shoes, essentials. Nothing excessive. Nothing uncertain. Downstairs, I could hear Daniel moving through the kitchen, the faint sound of a cabinet opening, then closing. He was still there, still trying to process what had shifted, but I could feel the distance growing, not in space, but in understanding. When I finished packing, I closed the suitcase and set it upright beside the bed. Then I walked over to the dresser and opened the top drawer, removing a small wooden box that Edward had given me years ago. It was simple, unadorned, but solid. Inside were a few personal items, things I had kept not because of their value, but because of what they represented. I looked at them briefly, then closed the lid and placed the box carefully into my bag. I did not need to take everything. Just what mattered. I picked up my purse and made one last slow pass through the room, not searching for anything, just acknowledging it. The bed. The lamp. The photograph on the nightstand of Edward and me from a summer long ago, both of us smiling at something outside the frame. I did not take the picture. It belonged to the house. Or perhaps the house belonged to it. Either way, I left it where it was. When I stepped back into the hallway, Daniel was at the bottom of the stairs, looking up at me. His expression had changed. There was less confusion now, more concern, but still not understanding. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice quieter than before. I adjusted my grip on the suitcase handle and began walking down the stairs, one step at a time. "I am leaving for a few days," I said. "I have some things to take care of." He took a step forward as I reached the bottom. "You do not have to leave," he said quickly. "We can talk about this. We can figure it out." I met his eyes briefly, then looked past him toward the front door. "I am not leaving because I have to," I said. "I am leaving because I have decided to." That seemed to stop him more than anything else. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, as if the words he had been preparing no longer applied. "Is this about what Jessica said?" he asked after a moment. I placed my suitcase near the door and reached for my coat, slipping it on with the same calm movements I had carried through the entire morning. "It is about what was said," I replied, "and what it revealed." He shook his head slightly, frustration beginning to surface. "You are taking this too far," he said. It was one moment. I paused with my hand on the doorknob and looked back at him, not with anger, but with a kind of quiet certainty. "It was not one moment," I said. "It was a confirmation." The words seemed to settle between us, heavier than the others. He did not respond right away. Instead, he ran a hand through his hair again, pacing a small step to the side, then back. "So what happens now?" he asked, his voice lower. I opened the door slightly, letting a line of daylight spill into the entryway. "Now," I said, "things move forward." He looked at me, waiting for more, for something concrete he could hold on to. I did not give it to him. Not yet. I stepped outside, pulling the door closed behind me with a soft, final sound. The air felt cooler than it had earlier, or perhaps I was simply more aware of it now. I placed my suitcase in the trunk of my car and slid into the driver's seat, setting my purse beside me. As I started the engine, my phone vibrated again. This time, it was not Daniel. It was an unknown number, but I recognized the pattern immediately. The bank. I answered it without hesitation. "Mrs. Whitmore," the woman's voice came through, steady and professional. "I wanted to inform you that the initial account restrictions have been successfully applied. All associated access points have been temporarily suspended pending review. Notifications are being processed and will be delivered within the next few hours. I listened carefully, the words aligning exactly with what had been set in motion. Thank you, I said simply. Please keep me updated on any developments. Of course, she replied. And if you need anything further, do not hesitate to reach out. The call ended, and I set the phone down gently. For a moment, I sat there, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, the engine running, the world outside continuing as it always had. Somewhere inside the house behind me, Daniel was still standing in that entryway, trying to understand what was happening. Somewhere else, Jessica was moving through her morning, unaware that the foundation she relied on had already begun to shift beneath her. I did not feel urgency. I did not feel hesitation. I shifted the car into drive and pulled away from the house, the tires rolling smoothly over the pavement. As I turned onto the main road, I glanced once in the rearview mirror, not to look back, but to acknowledge that I was no longer part of what was behind me in the same way. Then I focused forward, my hands steady, my path clear, knowing that by the time they realized what had changed, it would already be too late to pretend nothing had happened. Jessica called less than an hour after I left the house, her name flashing across the screen with a kind of urgency that did not exist the night before, and I let it ring twice before answering, not to create distance, but to make sure my voice would be as steady as everything else had been that morning. Margaret, she said immediately, skipping any form of greeting, her tone tight and controlled in a way that told me she was trying not to sound alarmed. There is something wrong with the accounts. I did not respond right away. I let her words settle into the silence between us, the same way hers had settled into that dining room the night before. What kind of problem? I asked finally, my voice calm, neutral, giving her nothing to hold on to. There was a brief pause on the other end, the kind that happens when someone realizes they are not in control of the conversation. The cards are not working, she said, her voice sharpening slightly. I tried to pay for something this morning, and it was declined. Daniel checked the other accounts, and they are all restricted. Did you know anything about this? I glanced at the road ahead, the steady movement of traffic continuing as if nothing had shifted. I am aware that changes have been made, I said. Another pause. Longer this time. What does that mean? She asked, and now the control in her voice was beginning to slip, replaced by something closer to confusion. It means, I said, choosing each word carefully, that certain conditions have been reviewed. I could hear her breathing change slightly, the rhythm tightening as she tried to process what I was saying. Conditions, she repeated. What conditions? Margaret, this is not a small issue. We have expenses. We have responsibilities. You cannot just interfere with things like this without talking to us. I let that sit for a moment, not because I needed to think, but because I wanted her to hear the space where her assumptions used to live. I did not interfere with anything that belongs to you, I said quietly. I reviewed what belongs to me. The silence that followed was different. Not confused. Not searching. It was the silence of realization beginning to take shape. Daniel said you went to the bank, she said, her voice lower now, more cautious. What exactly did you do? I turned onto a quieter street, the noise of traffic fading slightly as the surroundings shifted into something calmer, more contained. I asked questions, I replied. And I received answers. She exhaled sharply, the sound cutting through the line. This is not funny, she said. If you are trying to prove some kind of point, I am not trying to prove anything, I interrupted gently, not raising my voice, but making it clear that I would not follow her framing of the situation. I am addressing something that has already been made clear. There was a brief rustling sound, as if she had moved the phone or shifted her position, trying to regain footing. Look, she said, her tone shifting again, this time softer, more calculated. If this is about what I said last night, I think you are overreacting. It was a misunderstanding. People say things in the moment. I could almost see the expression on her face, the slight tilt of her head, the practiced calm she used when she believed she could guide a conversation back into her control. Yes, I said. People do say things in the moment. I let that acknowledgement sit, then added, and sometimes those moments reveal more than they intend to. Another silence. This one longer. So what are you saying? She asked finally. That you are punishing us. I considered the word carefully before responding. No, I said. I am not punishing anyone. I am making a decision based on information that has been available for quite some time. Her tone sharpened again. Available to who? She asked. Because Daniel and I have never seen anything like this. I nodded slightly to myself, even though she could not see it. That is correct, I said. You have not. I could hear the shift in her breathing again, faster now, less controlled. Margaret, this is not how families handle things, she said, her voice carrying a note of urgency that had not been there before. You cannot just lock people out without a conversation. I slowed the car as I approached a stoplight, watching it turn from green to yellow, then to red, the change steady and predictable. A conversation requires mutual respect, I said. And last night made it clear that we are not operating from the same understanding of that. She let out a short, frustrated breath. I said I was sorry, she said quickly. If that is what you need to hear, then fine. I am sorry. Can we just fix this now? I let her words pass without interruption, not because they held weight, but because I wanted to hear them fully. An apology is a statement, I said. What I am addressing is a pattern. The light turned green, and I pressed the accelerator gently, the car moving forward with a smooth, steady motion. This is getting out of control, she said, her voice rising slightly now. You are making this into something it does not have to be. I did not respond immediately. I allowed the quiet hum of the engine and the movement of the road to fill the space for a few seconds. It became something the moment it was spoken, I said finally. Everything since then has simply followed that. There was a long pause on the other end, and when she spoke again, her voice was different. Quieter. Less certain. What do you want? She asked. I considered the question, not because I did not know the answer, but because I understood that this was the first time she was asking it without assumption. I want clarity, I said. And I want it to be understood without explanation. She did not respond right away. For the first time since the call began, there was no attempt to redirect, no attempt to soften or control. Just silence. Then, slowly, she spoke. Daniel is going to call you, she said. You should talk to him. I glanced at the phone resting on the console, then back at the road ahead. He can call, I said. But the situation will not change because of a conversation. I could hear her inhale, as if preparing to say something more, then stop herself. This is not over, she said finally, her voice carrying a mixture of frustration and something else she was not ready to name. No, I said calmly. It is not. The line went quiet, and a moment later, the call ended. I placed the phone back down gently, my hands returning to the steering wheel, my posture unchanged. The road ahead remained clear, the direction steady, and for the first time since the night before, I could feel the full shape of what had begun to unfold. Not chaotic. Not reactive. Just precise. And entirely in motion. Daniel called 10 minutes after Jessica ended the call, his name appearing on the screen. Again, but this time there was no hesitation in the timing, no space left between attempts, just a direct response to what had already begun to unravel, and I answered on the second ring, not to keep him waiting, but because I already knew what he was going to say before he said it. Mom, he started, his voice tighter than it had been that morning, less controlled, more exposed. What is going on with the accounts? I kept my eyes on the road, the steady line of asphalt stretching forward, unbroken. They have been reviewed, I said calmly. There was a sharp exhale on the other end. Reviewed by who? He asked, the question coming out faster than he intended. By me, I replied. Silence followed, but it was not empty. It was full of realization, of connections forming in real time. You cannot just do that, he said after a moment, his voice lower now, as if he was trying to keep it from rising further. Those accounts are how we manage everything. The mortgage, the business expenses, the those accounts, I interrupted gently, are not structured the way you believe they are. Another pause. Longer this time. I could almost hear the shift in his posture, the way he might be standing still now, trying to piece together something that had never been explained to him. What does that mean? He asked. I turned onto a quieter road, the traffic thinning, the surroundings more open. It means, I said, that access and control are not the same thing. He did not respond immediately. When he did, his voice had changed again. Less defensive. More uncertain. Mom, what did Dad set up? He asked. The question landed differently than the others. Not accusatory. Not dismissive. Just searching. I allowed a brief silence before answering, not to create tension, but to give the truth the space it required. He set up protection, I said. For me. I could hear him inhale slowly, the sound steady but heavier than before. Protection from what? He asked. I did not rush the answer. From being placed in a position where I would have to ask for access to what is already mine, I said. The line went quiet again, and this time the silence stretched longer than any before it. I imagined him standing there, phone pressed to his ear, looking around. The house as if it might offer him an explanation it never had. We were not trying to take anything from you, he said finally, his voice softer now, but still holding on to something defensive beneath the surface. We have just been managing things. Making sure everything runs smoothly. I nodded slightly, even though he could not see it. I am aware of how things have been managed, I said. That is part of what has been reviewed. He shifted again, the faint sound of movement on his end. Jessica is really upset, he added, as if that detail might influence the situation. She feels like this came out of nowhere. I let that sit for a moment. It did not come out of nowhere, I said. It came out of observation. He exhaled again, longer this time, as if he was trying to release the tension building in him. So what happens now? He asked. The question was similar to the one he had asked earlier, but this time it carried more weight, more awareness of the answer he might receive. Now, I said, the structure adjusts to reflect what has been made clear. He was quiet again, but I could feel the difference. He was no longer trying to control the direction of the conversation. He was trying to understand it. Is there a way to fix this? He asked after a moment. I considered the question carefully. That depends on what you believe needs to be fixed, I said. He hesitated. The accounts, he said. The restrictions. Everything. I shook my head slightly, even though he could not see it. Those are outcomes, I said. Not the issue. Another pause. Then, slowly, then what is the issue? He asked. I took a breath, not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted the answer to be clear, not emotional. The issue, I said, is that you have been operating as if my presence is optional. The words settled between us, heavy but precise. He did not interrupt. And last night, I continued, it was made clear that it is not just optional. It is dismissible. I let the silence hold after that, giving him space to absorb what I had said. That is not how I see you, he said finally, his voice quiet, almost careful. That may not be how you describe it, I replied, but it is how it has functioned. He did not argue. That, more than anything else, told me he understood more than he was willing to say. So what are you asking for? He said after a moment. I glanced ahead, the road opening up, the horizon clear. I am not asking for anything, I said. I am setting a standard. He was silent again, and this time there was no immediate follow-up. Just the sound of his breathing, steady but heavier than before. Jessica is going to want to talk to you again, he said eventually. She is not going to let this go. I allowed a small pause before responding. This is not about whether she lets it go, I said. This is about whether she understands what has already happened. He did not respond right away. Then, quietly, I think I am starting to, he said. I did not comment on that. Understanding is not something that can be confirmed in a single sentence. It shows itself over time, through actions, through choices. There will be formal communication, I added. You should read it carefully when it arrives. He inhaled again, slower now. Is this legal? He asked. The question was direct, stripped of everything else. Yes, I said simply. That answer seemed to settle something in him, not in a comforting way, but in a clarifying one. Okay, he said after a moment. Then I will wait for that. I nodded slightly. That would be wise, I said. There was one last pause, and then his voice softened further. Mom, he said, I did not realize it had gotten to this point. I let that statement sit for a moment before responding. That is part of the problem, I said. The line went quiet again, and this time neither of us rushed to fill it. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady but subdued. I will call you later, he said. After we receive the documents. You can, I replied. But the documents will not change. There was no argument after that. Just a quiet acknowledgement. I understand, he said. The call ended a moment later, and I placed the phone back down, my hands returning to the wheel, my focus steady. The road ahead remained unchanged, but everything behind me had already begun to shift, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that would be impossible to ignore once it fully settled into place. The documents arrived that afternoon, not with noise or warning, but with the quiet certainty of something that had already been decided long before anyone realized it would matter, and I was sitting by the window in the same small hotel room when my phone buzzed again, this time with a message notification rather than a call, a short confirmation from the bank followed by a second message from Daniel that simply read, "We got them." I did not open his message right away. Instead, I looked out at the parking lot below, watching a man load groceries into the back of his car, moving slowly, methodically, unaware that somewhere else, in a house not far from here, the structure of someone else's life had just shifted in a way that could not be undone. I reached for my phone and opened the official email first, not out of priority, but out of habit, reading each line carefully, confirming what I already knew. The language was formal, precise, leaving no room for interpretation. Temporary restriction of access. Review of compliance conditions. Notification of controlling authority. My name appeared exactly where it was supposed to, steady and unambiguous. When I finished, I set the phone down gently on the table and allowed a brief moment of stillness to pass, not because I needed time to process, but because I understood the weight of what had just been put into motion. On the other side of this moment, nothing would return to what it had been. My phone buzzed again, this time with a call. Daniel. I answered on the first ring. Mom, he said, his voice already different from before, less uncertain now, but heavier, grounded in something he had read and could no longer dismiss. We received the documents. I did not respond immediately. I let him continue. She is trying to understand them, he added, the pause between his words carrying more meaning than the words themselves. There is a clause, he continued, his voice tightening slightly, about conduct. About actions that can affect access. Is that real? I turned my gaze back toward the window, the light shifting slightly as clouds moved across the sky. Yes, I said. There was a long pause. I could hear faint movement on his end, as if he had stepped away from the room, or perhaps from her. It says that any behavior that undermines or disrespects the primary beneficiary can trigger a reassessment, he said slowly, reading from the document, each word landing more heavily than the last. That includes public statements. I let the silence hold for a moment before responding. It does, I said. He exhaled quietly, the sound controlled but weighted. So last night, he said, not finishing the sentence, not needing to. Last night, I repeated, was not just a moment. He did not argue. He did not deflect. That, more than anything else, told me he had read carefully. Jessica says this is being taken out of context, he added, though his voice carried less conviction than it had before. She says it was a misunderstanding. I allowed a brief pause, not to dismiss her claim, but to place it in the context it belonged. Context does not change what was said, I replied. It only explains how comfortable someone felt saying it. Another silence followed, and this one was different. It was not confusion. It was recognition. There is also a section about immediate enforcement, he continued after a moment. About restricting access until a review is complete. That is what is happening now, right? I nodded slightly, even though he could not see it. Yes, I said. He inhaled slowly, the sound steady but heavier than before. Jessica is asking what it will take to reverse this, he said. The question was direct, but it did not come from him. I could hear that clearly. This is not something that is reversed by asking, I said. It is something that is addressed by understanding. He was quiet again, and I could imagine him standing somewhere in that house, the same house that had once felt stable, now holding a different kind of tension, one that could not be smoothed over with conversation alone. She wants to talk to you, he said after a moment. She says there has to be a way to fix this. I turned slightly in my chair, adjusting my posture, my voice remaining even. She had an opportunity to speak clearly last night, I said. She chose her words carefully. They should be treated with the same level of care now. There was a pause, then a quiet shift in his tone. Mom, he said, softer now, this is serious. I let that statement settle before responding. Yes, I said. It is. The simplicity of the answer seemed to carry more weight than anything else I could have added. I do not think she understood what she was doing, he said, and this time, the uncertainty had returned, but in a different form. Not defensive. Just, searching. Understanding is not a requirement for consequences, I replied. It is a result of them. He did not respond right away. I could hear faint voices in the background now, distant, unclear, but present. Jessica, most likely, moving through the same realization from a different angle. She is asking if this means we are being cut off, he said finally. The question was direct, stripped of everything else. It means access has been restricted, I said. And it will remain that way until the review is complete. And the review, he asked carefully, what determines the outcome? I looked down at my hands for a moment, then back out at the light shifting across the parking lot. That depends on what has been demonstrated, I said. He was silent again, and this time the silence carried a different weight. Not confusion. Not resistance. Just the slow, steady process of understanding something that could not be undone. I think I understand now, he said quietly. I did not confirm it. Understanding is not something that needs to be declared. It reveals itself in what comes next. We will read everything again, he added after a moment. Carefully this time. I nodded slightly. That would be appropriate, I said. There was one last pause, then his voice returned, softer than before. Mom, he said, I did not see it the way you did. I let that sit for a moment before responding. That is because you were not the one it was directed at, I said. The line went quiet after that, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, slowly, he said, I will call you later. You can, I replied. But the documents will not change. He did not argue. I know, he said. The call ended a moment later, and I set the phone down beside me, my hands resting calmly in my lap. Outside, the man in the parking lot closed his trunk and drove away, his car disappearing around the corner as if nothing had changed. But something had. And this time, it was no longer hidden beneath politeness or assumption. It was written. It was delivered. And it was understood, whether they were ready to accept it or not. The house felt different when I returned that evening, not because anything had physically changed, but because the illusion that once held everything together had already been removed, and when a structure loses its illusion, what remains is something far more honest, and far less comfortable. I let myself in without knocking, the familiar sound of the door opening no longer carrying the same sense of belonging it once had. Inside, the lights were on, but the energy had shifted. The air felt tighter, quieter, as if every movement inside the house was now measured, cautious. Daniel was sitting in the living room, the documents spread out on the coffee table in front of him, each page carefully aligned as if he had read them more than once, trying to find a version that would say something different. Jessica stood near the window, her arms crossed, her posture rigid, her eyes fixed on something outside that did not require her attention. When the door closed behind me, both of them turned. Neither spoke immediately. That alone told me everything had changed. I set my purse down on the table by the door and walked into the room at the same steady pace I had carried all day, not rushing, not hesitating, simply present. "You came back," Daniel said finally, his voice quieter than usual, as if he was not entirely sure what tone was appropriate anymore. "I did," I replied. Jessica shifted slightly, uncrossing her arms, then crossing them again, a small movement that revealed more than any words could have. "We read everything," she said, her voice controlled, but lacking the confidence it had carried the night before. I nodded once. "Good," I said. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything that had been left unsaid for a long time, now sitting in the room with us, impossible to ignore. Daniel gestured slightly toward the documents. "Is this really how it is structured?" he asked. "All of it. The trust. The company. The access." I walked over and glanced at the papers briefly, not to review them, but to acknowledge their presence. "Yes," I said. Jessica let out a short breath. Not quite a laugh, not quite frustration. "So you just decided to do this," she said. "Without even talking to us first." I looked at her, meeting her eyes without any shift in my expression. "I decided to respond to what was made clear," I said. Her jaw tightened slightly. "You are blowing this out of proportion," she said. "What I said last night was intentional," I interrupted, my voice still calm, still even, but firm in a way that did not require volume. She stopped speaking, the words catching before they could form. "You chose those words," I continued. "In that moment. In that room. In front of everyone." Daniel shifted slightly in his seat, his gaze moving between us, but he did not interrupt. Jessica straightened, her posture tightening again as she tried to regain control of the conversation. "People say things they do not mean," she said. "It does not justify this." I let a small pause settle before responding. "It does not justify what has been put in place," I said. "It activates it." That distinction seemed to land differently. She blinked once, her expression shifting, not to understanding, but to the realization that this was not something she could argue into changing. "So what now?" she asked, her voice sharper now, edged with frustration. "Are you just going to keep everything locked down indefinitely?" I turned slightly, looking at the documents again, then back at her. "That depends," I said, "on what is demonstrated moving forward." Daniel leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on his knees. "What does that mean?" he asked. I met his eyes briefly. "It means that access is not automatic," I said. "It is conditional." Jessica let out another breath, this one heavier. "Conditional on what?" she asked. I held her gaze, steady, unchanging. "On behavior," I said. The words settled into the room, simple, clear, unavoidable. She looked away first, her eyes shifting toward the window again, but this time there was no focus in them, just movement. "This is ridiculous," she said quietly, though the conviction behind the words had weakened. "You are turning one moment into a system of control." I shook my head slightly. "No," I said. "The system was always there." I let that sit, then added, "You just did not realize it applied to you." Daniel exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just slightly, as if the tension he had been holding all day had finally found a place to settle. "So what do we do?" he asked again, but this time the question was different. Not resistant. Not dismissive. Just real. I looked at him for a moment before answering. "You pay attention," I said. "You understand what is written. And you decide how you want to move within it." Jessica turned back toward me, her expression now more guarded than before. "And if we do not agree with it," she said. I held her gaze without hesitation. "Agreement is not a requirement," I said. "Compliance is." The silence that followed was complete. No movement. No interruption. Just the weight of what had been made clear. After a moment, I reached for my purse, lifting it from the table. "I will not be staying here tonight," I said, my tone unchanged. Daniel nodded slowly, as if he had expected that. Jessica did not respond. She remained where she was, her posture still, her expression unreadable, but no longer confident. I walked toward the door, my steps measured, the same as they had been all day. When I reached it, I paused briefly, my hand resting on the handle. "This is not about punishment," I said without turning around. "It is about structure." I opened the door and stepped outside, the evening air cool and steady against my skin. Behind me, the house remained exactly where it had always been, but what it represented had shifted entirely. And as I walked toward my car, I realized something with a clarity that left no room for doubt. She thought she had humiliated me in front of everyone. But all she had done was reveal exactly where she stood. And now, for the first time, so did I.